So up on the screen we've got the logo that they decided to use for HTML5. And of course, what does it look like? Looks like a superhero, right? So that's what I've got here. This is what is HTML5, and so I'm using my little Superman character here with friends. And you know, back in the 70s or 80s, they had the superheroes, the Super Friends. Some of you probably remember, some of you probably don't. I do remember it. And so you've got Superman as kind of the central character, and then you've got all the supporting cast, the Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman with her invisible jet and whatnot. And actually, before I forget, could someone in the back adjust the camera just to make sure that it's actually pointing at the newly sized screen? There's a zoom on the top. Is it all right?
Yep.
Okay. So we got the superhero in the middle with other superhero friends. HTML5 is kind of like that in a lot of ways. It's meant to be this exciting new thing, this superhero kind of a technology. But what do we mean by that? So HTML5 is a specification. It's the next version of HTML. It's not even official yet. But it's supported, sort of, out there, and that's the way things are headed. Let me kind of trace a brief history. I won't bore you with the history, but I do think it's kind of important to at least go through some parts of it. This is probably a little bit more accurate representation of HTML5 as opposed to the superhero image, and this is kind of a cool sculpture that I found. It's incomplete. And by incomplete, I mean the specification is actually pretty good. It's not finished yet, but in terms of implementation, rather than the image of the superheroes looking all strong and buff and colorful and whatnot, we've got this kind of gray man with a briefcase with his torso missing. And that's kind of, in a lot of ways, what HTML5 is to a certain extent. Now, you can do a lot with HTML5, but if all you do is use it as it is written without playing around with some JavaScript and ARIA and kind of bringing in the friends, then we've got some missing parts. So HTML5 really it's kind of a buzzword that means more than just HTML5. It means HTML5 plus. And the plus brings in some of these things which maybe a little bit small, maybe larger. So and I'll go through some of these. So we've got the HTML5 markup itself. We've got parts built into it. We have audio, video, a canvas for drawing, 2D, drag and drop, web workers. Who knows what web workers are? Of course you do. Someone want to explain what web workers do?
Multi-threading.
Yeah, sorry, multi-threading, yes. So the idea behind it is, instead of having just one task that's running at a time, you can set something running and you can do other things, and it makes it more efficient, makes it so you can actually call it real programming and get things done. And so it becomes an efficient way to handle interactivity on the web. And then WebSockets is kind of a companion to that idea. So who can explain what that one is in short terms? Oh, come on, somebody's got to know. Well, the idea is, instead of, in probably most of the programming that you're doing, it's going to be you writing some software, the JavaScript, that receives input from the user, right? Or the page loads, or the user does something, and at that point, you have something to work with. But until the user does something else again, you just kind of have to sit there and wait, right? So the WebSocket approach introduces bidirectionality. So you allow the web server, or you allow the script to continually go back and forth. So it's not just a wait, sit and wait approach. It's actually, you're able to have that kind of communication going back and forth in the script, and it's more active. So it's things like that make HTML5 give it its promise. And I'll just go down through the list of microdata, web storage, HTML plus RDF. I'm not going to go much into that one, but And then related technologies is CSS3. So this is where you get some kind of animation effects, and you get curves and on your divs and borders, and you can do quite a bit with CSS3, and a lot of it is actually doable now. You put shadows on your text. I don't know if you need to do that, but you can. Of course, backwards compatibility becomes an issue, as you already know, but pretty cool some of the things you can do with CSS3. MathML for putting up math equations and things like that. Geolocate, or SVG, for scalable vector graphics. So that's similar to what you can do in Flash, and I'll come back to that. Geolocation, and I've got a list of other things. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's too much to talk about, but these are the friends. These are the super friends, right? And so without the list of friends, HTML5 at the moment is kind of the concept is great, but it's not quite there in terms of implementation. So this is kind of one way to look at it. And it's not that Flash is a bad thing. But HTML5 is a replacement for Flash, is what the slide says. So why was Flash invented? It was invented because HTML was so static and so boring, and you couldn't do anything. And even with JavaScript, you just kind of looked at it and went, oh, I wish it could actually do something fun. And so they invented Flash, and it's served its purpose really well, and it still serves its purpose. But things are headed in a different direction. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Flash has a bit of a half-life and is kind of declining. Maybe it'll still be around 10 years from now, but I kind of think it's going to be HTML5 and whatever comes after that. So, and I think pretty much most of the people in this room would agree with that it's headed that direction, because HTML5 in its intent can do pretty much everything that Flash ever could, and more. All right, in fact, if you look at some of the trends, this is just Google trends. So searches for Flash developer over time, that's the top graph, is kind of declining. Searches for HTML5 developers is increasing. Something similar down here when you got HTML5 developer Flash and then Web 2.0. So Web 2.0 is kind of effectively, Web 2.0 was the other buzzword that came before HTML5, and that buzzword is the yellow on the bottom where it has a large bump and it's kind of going down, down, down. So people still talk about Web 2.0, but HTML5 is kind of the next generation of what they meant when they were talking about Web 2.0. And this just shows you the HTML5 versus Web 2.0 in Google searches. Now that's not terribly important, but I'm just showing you that it's this is the direction of the future. That's what people are looking for. That's what people are talking about. All right, HTML5 introduces some new elements into and attributes and a few other things. So one of them is a data list. In fact, let me just list them really quickly, and then we'll go back and talk about them individually. So data list is a way to have kind of an auto prediction. Keygen and output. Well, keygen is not particularly relevant to our topic here of accessibility. Output. So output is when you have a calculation, let's say that's done in a form field, and you want it to show dynamically, you could put it in the output element. And of course, you'd have to have some sort of script that's populating it, but that's what that one does. Then you've got the media elements, audio, video. So before, you had to use something like Flash. You had to use QuickTime, or going farther back, you could get into like Shockwave or something like that. But there's always a plugin. You couldn't just put in a video file or just put in an audio file. You had to use something else. You could put a link to it, but it was a plugin of some sort that, do you have a plugin? This works best in this plugin versus that plugin. Are you on Windows? Do you have QuickTime installed? You have to worry about all of that. With HTML5, you don't get to not worry about that yet, but that's where it's headed. And so there are native audio and video players embedded in the browsers now. Like you could insert a video right now, and it would work in the current browsers. You can insert an audio track, audio right now, and it would just be using HTML, no plugin required. But as Dylan was pointing out, there are some flaws in the implementation. Most of them are keyboard accessible when they do implement it, but most of them also do not make it accessible to screen readers. So it's not really viable to just use them out of the box. But you can use the, and this applies not just to audio and video, but to every HTML5 element and attribute that's out there. You can take those elements and attributes, play with them with a little bit of JavaScript, throw in some ARIA, kind of cook it up, and then produce something that is actually really good, works in all browsers, and is accessible. Because all the technology and the know-how is already there. The browsers know what they should do, and programmers who know what they're doing know what they can do, and so they do it. And at some point along the way, we probably won't have to give lots of these talks on some of these features, because the browsers will just let you put in the video, let you put in the audio, let you put in some of these other things without you having to do anything, and it will be accessible. And you just kind of say, it's just like putting an image. You know, you still have to put in an alt attribute for the image, but you know that's easy compared to writing an entire JavaScript to figure out how to create an accessible media player. You know, that's a huge difference. At the same time, HTML5 is powerful enough that you can do that whenever you want to. So 20 years is probably too far. Let's say 3 years down the road, even if all the browsers implement HTML5 perfectly, and all the components are accessible perfectly, someone's going to come along and say, yeah, but I kind of want it to do this. And the native browser elements don't do that. So I still want to use HTML5 plus scripting plus ARIA, and I can create my own media player, which is what everyone's doing now, and I can make it a little bit better according to my specifications. So HTML5 and ARIA still are going to have a role, but we don't have to go that route, or we won't have to go that route in the future. That's kind of the vision of HTML5. Some of the other features worth talking about, I'm going to spend some time going through this. Semantic and structural elements. So if you're listening to a web page and all you hear is a bunch of text, you get the information, but it's not organized in a way that really makes sense. So we're looking at this page right now, and this happens to be organized with some headings. Semantic and structural elements is the heading. And then I ended up with this. No, of course not. I might need new batteries. Is Nancy here? I get all of that luck. All right. I'll talk loud until I get new batteries. That's not hooked up to the audio system. In fact, we couldn't. Yeah, this room has its flaws too. This is kind of like HTML5. It has all the promise, and it looks great, and the specs are perfect, but then implementation not so great. All right, so semantic and structural elements. When you're listening to a web page with a screen reader and you can't see it at all, or what I was saying is, okay, so I organized this actually in a definition list. So I've got my terms there and I defined them. Most of you probably don't use definition lists very frequently. They come in handy for something like this. But when you come across a definition list, using a screen reader, it'll tell you that it's a list, a definition list. If it's an unordered list, it'll say bullet before the items. If it's a numbered list, it'll say the number. So that matters. And it will also say headings. Heading level 1, heading level 2, reads all that. And these new elements here just go a little bit beyond that. So article is one, so if you've got a news website or a blog, you can put it in article tags. If you've got, and in that article, if you've got something that's not for the main flow of the content, but it's something off to the side, you can give it an aside tag. Others that I'll talk about, we skip some of them for now, but okay, figure and figure caption. So in the figure tag, you can actually put in images and other things, and then figure caption puts the, in a newspaper, for example, it's common to have, or a scholarly paper, you put the figure and then you describe it right below. But if you're used to just putting in alt text, that's hidden, like no one can see it. So the only people that know about the alt text are the people who are blind and using a screen reader. So this is just another way of implementing access to figures and charts and things like that. Footer and header are part of the main navigation. So let me, oh, now I don't have the microphone. Let me, bring up a screen reader and see if anyone can hear it. I don't know if this is going to work or not. Well, we'll find out.
HTML5 previous next is HTML5 form elements Windows Internet Explorer.
Okay, so this is NVDA that I happen to be in at the moment. I've got JAWS on here, I've got VoiceOver. This being a Mac, I can kind of put whatever I want on it. And if you're using VoiceOver, if you're using NVDA, the keyboard shortcut that you would use to go through headings. Now this page actually is not a good example of headings because it's only got the one in the middle, so let me go to a little bit different one.
Caps lock off, cap close, main navigation, the new replacement for flash, the new west, top in close, open, headings, top type headings, landmarks, moving, headings, link, visited headings, structure, and semantics, link, skin, navigate. First of all, is that sort of audible in the back? Sort of. That's as high as it goes. All right, so if you're using NVDA, you would use the D key. Navigation landmark topics heading level 2. Okay, or sorry, that's for doing the landmarks. HTML5 accessible main landmark headings heading level 1. Yeah, so the H key will take you through the headings, and you can go through. Let me just do it a couple times, and they'll talk about it. Create a logical outline of the web page with headings heading level 2. Example heading level 3. Make headings brief, clear, informative, and unique heading level 2. Okay, so it's reading the heading, and you can see that it's also navigating by headings. It's skipping everything else, so it's only reading the headings. And that's what we wanted to do. And why do we want it to do that? Because if you're using a screen reader, you can't see the whole page, right? So if you're using headings properly, when you go through them, you're able to get, basically it's like glancing at a web page. So instead of having to listen to the whole thing, like this is a particularly long web page, I just want to get, find out what's on the page, so I can go heading, okay, I get the idea, and then I can go back to the heading that I'm most interested in, right? So headings and structure are extremely important just for that purpose. It saves time, and it gives them an idea of how the page is organized. So that's a good thing, but you can also misuse headings. Headings, structure, and semantics, kit navigation, did class alert, these from, please turn on JavaScript /from/ed, this also makes use of accessible modern web technologies, and require caps lock on. Alright, so now this is a website that I put together, let me enlarge just a tiny bit, that has some accessibility problems built into it on purpose, kind of to show the good and bad example, right? So they use all kinds of things. They use ARIA, they use headings, they use landmarks, they've got JavaScript. If you click around a bit, you can see that a lot of this is quite dynamic. So you select a radio button, and it modifies the what's available below that. And if you scroll down a little bit more, you'll see that we've got this scrolling area here. And these are the special offers. No good? Nope. All right. All right. So let me focus just on this scrolling area here. Now, the way that this has been marked up, it turns out, is that every single one of these special offers has been marked with an H3. And so if you look at the headings, and so I've got several different extensions on here that can do that. This is just the quick fast, but I know that's super small. You don't have to be able to read them. The point of this is that there are a lot of headings here for a really short web page. And it's not that this is entirely wrong, like this is a legitimate heading for this paragraph. But if we look closely, which I know a lot of you can't do, but if you look closely at what's actually here, in the heading structure, what's not there is the special offers at the top. So special offers really is the heading of that group, but it's not marked up as a heading. And all of the special offers are marked up as headings. So this is an overuse of headings in kind of a bad way. So I'm pointing it out with headings first because that's easy to understand, it's common. So now let me take it back over to talking about the HTML5 elements. And we've got, let me close this one. We've got some new elements here, and one of them I haven't gotten down to is section down here. So we've got lots of new elements to play with. We've got section, we've got header, footer, nav, main, and search, and a few other things. Kind of throwing in some ARIA there too. But with what we have here, we can create a logical structure for a document. So if we go back up to the top here, let me zoom out just so you can see the whole thing. So in this particular structure, I've got something at the top which is HTML5 accessibility, and that would make sense that that could be what we would call an HTML5 a header. And over on the left, we've got a navigation region, which we could mark up as a navigation region. We've got main content, and then at the bottom we've got a footer. And so if we do that, and now if we go back over to NVDA, we can navigate by those regions. So let me do that really quickly.
Caps lock off, caps lock off. Each style font weight, but content info landmark copyright 2013 Tech Systems.
Okay, so that read the bottom and may have gone a little bit too fast. Let me just let it cycle through.
No next landmark.
Well, that's the bottom, okay.
Main. Outer no previous landmark. Main landmark list with 2 items. Previous button next.
Okay, so it said main landmark. Main meaning that's the HTML. So there are actually a couple things going on here. I am using the main tag, like MAIN, that's the tag. I'm also using something else. So let me.
Heading, multi-beat landmark, heading, visual users edit from headings, because heading text is big and low, making the page structure more obvious and easier to scan. Caps lock off, caps lock off.
Oh.
Skip, heading, structure, and semantics skip.
All right, that's the other downside of screen readers. So keep reading. Go back over to landmarks. Okay, so here's a mapping. I want people to be able to actually see this one. So in HTML5 we have some tags. In ARIA we have some similar attributes, and they kind of map to each other. They're not an exact mapping, and they weren't really intended to be, but they kind of are. So the one that's in the middle where the bar is, that's the one that says main, and it says role equals main. So the recommendation here is that we want to be able to let screen reader users navigate from region to region, and we want them to know what the regions are. The HTML, and this will be in some of the materials that I probably won't just show because it'll take a while to go through, but a lot of the HTML5 regions don't have the same type of support. In fact, they're not treated in the same way as the ARIA landmarks. ARIA landmarks have better support for being able to navigate by landmark. So I double them up, because by doubling them up, you're kind of meeting both needs. You're kind of future-proofing it by putting it in the HTML5. ARIA has more support now, so you put that in there now. And then when you're navigating with your screen reader, it'll read things appropriately. So it'll come to the header region, and it would have been convenient if they'd chosen the same word, but one says header, the other says banner. One says nav, the other says navigation. Now main is actually both main. Then footer, and then content info is the other one down here. That one, no one really, well, maybe Joseph knows why he put that there. And it's one of those things that if you just hear content info, or as Josh says content info, you don't really know what that means unless you had practice listening to it. And so it would have made sense to me to call it footer. But there's something you can do in addition to that to make it read more friendly for people who aren't sure what that means. And that you can add an ARIA label. So so basically you put them all together, and I don't know if I had this like document them all together, but oh yeah, I do. I don't have the ARIA label in this particular example, but what I do have is header, role equals banner, so it's all in the same tag. Header or nav, role equals navigation, and main, role equals main. So this one down here is the one I was talking about, footer, role equals content info, and you would just add another attribute that says ARIA label equals, whatever you want to call it, footer or something like that. Now, this is actually very, very useful for someone who's using a screen reader. Most screen reader users at this point probably don't even know that they can navigate this way. That's just being honest about it. If they're in accessibility, if they're doing it on a regular basis, then they do know that they can do that. Most of them by now do know that they can navigate by headings, but they're becoming more aware that they can navigate by these regions. So if someone says, you know, someone's blind, you tell them I put in all these roles, you know, and landmark roles, and put in the HTML5 semantic elements, and it should be just great and accessible. They're like, what? And you know, that's just kind of the way it is. Not everyone's a power user, but word is getting out, and it is becoming more common. So this potentially can help people navigate very quickly. So, you know, if you want to get directly to the main content, you just use the keyboard shortcut until it says main landmark, or whatever the screen reader. Screen readers always say things a little bit differently between brands, but you know, you get the idea. So when you get to main, you're there, and you skipped over everything. So this side navigation over here, especially when it's all expanded, can be quite a lot. We want to allow them to skip over that. I put together, and this is something that I'm not going to go through in a lot of detail in the presentation, but you'll be able to get it later. So this is the same idea with HTML5 for this first group. So put a header, nav, main, section, article, aside, and a footer. I did it just with HTML5, and then I did it with ARIA, and then I did it with both of them together. And as I was saying, this is usually the recommended approach because that covers the most bases. And I'm going to back up just a little bit and mention that section, so section is, section, right? What is very generic. It doesn't really mean, it is semantic, but it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing on every website. If you have one section, or one website uses section one way, another website can use section a slightly different way, and it's meant to be kind of generic like that, which is fine. But now, going on what I was just saying about being able to navigate quickly through elements, now let's say that you're the screen reader user, and you're hoping to get quickly to, let's say the footer, or main is probably the more common thing. And there are 17 sections on the page, 5 different navigation regions, footer, and a main. You know, by then you've got this really long list of landmarks that is kind of destroying the purpose of being able to navigate quickly, even though you may be using them correctly. So I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying think about how it's used and why it's there. So, I mean, one thing you could do is simplify the web page and just design it a little bit differently. That's probably the best approach for something like that. And then you might be down to 3 sections and a main and maybe 2 navigation regions or something like that. But you know, that's the semantic information that you do want to get across. Just don't overload them with so much that it becomes just noise. Right? Make sense?
Yes.
Yes?
When you have a browser that doesn't recognize HTML5 yet, and it comes to an HTML5 tag, it'll just ignore it, right?
Yes.
If you have a ARIA role inside of the HTML5 tag and your browser doesn't recognize HTML5 yet, will it just skip over the
Oh,
role?
well, ignore, we have to define what ignore means. Ignore means it won't interpret it as anything special. So if it comes across an HTML5 tag that it doesn't recognize, it'll just say, what's that? I don't know. And it'll just read the text, whatever's in that tag, whatever's in that tag, it'll just read it like text. It'll treat it like a div or a span or whatever.
So it'll still look inside of it?
Yeah, it's not invisible. It's just, it just won't know what it is or how to handle it, so it'll just read it as if it's plain text.
And then when it comes to ARIA that it does know, it'll go.
Yeah. I mean, the only difference is that one will inform the DOM in the browser what it is, and the other will just say, I don't know what that is. You know, the DOM won't know, but it'll still read the text. Is there someone else who was asking a question? Yeah.
Are some of those examples reading the same thing twice? And
Yes.
that's recommendable?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's a good point too.
I think further down, there was
Yeah, that's
something
further
like header banner, and that's what will be read.
It actually depends on the screen reader, so that's another thing. Should go back down to the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
So for example, NVDA, so generally, and yeah, I may get some disagreement, maybe Paul or someone can chime in, but in what I've done in my testing, NVDA and Firefox tend to be one of the better combinations for testing for ARIA, but I know that others do. Is that a...
NVDA and Firefox is the best.
Yeah, okay. So, as you can see, it says it just once, which is what you'd want. JAWS at least does say it, but it does say it twice. But what it's, let me back up though. What it's saying twice is actually the label plus telling you what it is. So if you look closely what I'm doing, so this is up here. This is my description of what it is. This is a nav tag with world navigation and ARIA label of main navigation. So JAWS is actually giving us the label and then telling us what it's labeling, a navigation region. NVDA is actually ignoring the label, so in this case it's not actually doing much of a favor here. It's just telling us what the tag is, what it is. And then VoiceOver kind of does what JAWS does. It gives us the label plus what it is. So that's a good point. So I do recommend combining them. I don't necessarily recommend always putting a label on them. So in this case, the duplication is because of the label.
The labeling is particularly useful when you're using the same role multiple times
Yes.
on a page. Useful to mention. If you only have one navigation landmark, then you don't necessarily.
Right, exactly.
If you have two or three, it becomes more relevant.
Yeah. So this last example is kind of throwing the kitchen sink as everything's in there. So it's overkill for this particular tag. If you go down to the bottom for the footer, unless you're doing web development, no one really knows what content info means, especially if it's pronounced as content info or content information. So I put in a label for that one. I mean, that seems like a good practice. But other than that, like if you only have one nav, one main, one footer, honestly, you probably don't need any labels. Except perhaps for that one, because that's kind of confusing content info.
And you can only have one of content info and main.
That's true too.
So, but navigation, yeah, you could differentiate those with ARIA label.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine a scenario where you've got a main navigation and maybe a side navigation, something like that. All right. Let me head back up to my list of things here. So this is just showing the figure and fig caption. So actually, this is a good example of what you asked. So this figure and fig caption, all it is, well, it's a picture, right? So you can see the picture. We just go to the code. And in the code, it's just a figure tag with an image thrown in it and a fig caption tag thrown in it also. So when a browser comes across it that doesn't have a clue what figure or fig caption are, it'll just treat it like an image with a paragraph, basically. And this one is already pretty much accessible even in the really old browsers because there's nothing really to do except tell you that there's an image and there's the caption. One thing that I did here that's worth pointing out, which it'll depend on the circumstances, but I put in null alt text for the image. So one rule of thumb is you don't want to leave out the alt attribute because then the screen reader will probably read it'll say graphic, and then it will probably read the file name, which in this case is bobwellpark.jpg, which is not a bad file name. You can probably figure out something from that. But if it were more obtuse, if it said image.jpg, then that's what it would say, and that would be your alt text. So
the fact that we have the caption right after that and it's visible for everybody, basically that's our alt text. So I just put in alt equals quote, quote, nothing in the middle, to say that we don't need alt text for this because I put it in the big caption below. But anyway, I'm not saying this is always the solution. There may be some circumstances where you want to put in alt and the caption. Maybe you want to say something just to your blind users. And now this is one that's actually this is another good example of what you asked, because this one doesn't work in this browser. So the details tag doesn't work in Firefox, but if I pull it over to Safari or Chrome, it does work. So this is, it's an expandable region, and it's keyboard accessible, but I haven't, to be honest, I haven't played with it with a screen reader. Basically, all of these new elements, you can kind of assume at this point that you're going to need to enhance them for screen reader accessibility. That's pretty much across the board. Even, it is keyboard accessible though, I'll point that out. So I can, I put the focus in there. So I can focus on it and I can hit enter. So I can work it with the keyboard, so that's good. But it doesn't even work in Firefox or most of the other browsers, so this is what it looks like. But it's kind of a cool feature of the future. Let's talk a little bit about audio and video and some of the things to keep in mind there. So this is one of the slides I didn't quite finish filling in, but okay, I'll just mention briefly. So there is an audio player, comes with a browser, and every browser has one at this point. And it is keyboard accessible in all the ones that I tested. Most of them don't read particularly well for screen readers, like they don't see the play button, or they don't read the pause, or they don't read the controls particularly well by screen readers. So that's another thing that you'd have to enhance with JavaScript to make it a little bit better. And people have done that. So I've got some lists, must be on a different page. Or actually, I've got lists of video players. I didn't put it in for audio players. Let me just jump there so I can show you what I mean. So there's a list of video players, and I'm not endorsing them all as being equally accessible. I'm just saying here are some examples of JavaScript plus HTML5. So I guess, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. This is less for accessibility that I'm listing them, and more just for saying, look, you can do this, and you can enhance HTML5 with some JavaScript. But let me go back quickly to the audio. One thing you have to keep in mind, zoom out a little bit, is that not all browsers support the same file formats. So when you produce audio on the web and you want to use HTML5, you can't just use one file format. So if you want to do it in MP3, that's great, but that won't work in some browsers. There's the OGG standard, which works in some browsers. And the same problem comes up when you're working with video, is that they're not equally supported. So here's a table of support across different browsers for different file formats. So the way that you accomplish it, I believe, yeah, so here's some, that's right on the line. So what you do is you refer, and the highlighted part is not the part I'm talking about at the moment, but there's two source types. One is the MP4 in this case, and one is the WebM format. And you just cascade them. So if a browser supports one, it'll take it. If it supports the other, it'll take it. And you can keep cascading until it takes something. And then last of all, you could put in, which I didn't in this example, but you can put in a sentence that says your browser doesn't support anything. Go get a new browser. But you can keep cascading like that. Now, what this is showing is something that I need to talk about briefly too. So with any kind of video content, you have to take into account the fact that someone's going to be deaf. And this is going to be rare, but someone could be both deaf and blind. And a transcript is really the only way to provide access to video content for someone who's both deaf and blind. There's no way I can get through it all. with HTML5, you can add captions. Let me just show you an example of that. I should do that. And if I can remember where I put the link. There it is. So this one I have to take over to Chrome as well. And it's not that, I've taken 2 examples over to Chrome. Generally, the thing is that there's no one browser that is best in everything for HTML5. Some things work better in Chrome, some things work better in Firefox, some things work better in mobile, iOS. It's hit or miss. So, but I do want to show that
The web is always changing, and there will be access to this changing.
So,
The source of that change is you. Developers all around the world who are using our tools to create great new things.
so this is a commercial, which we don't have to listen
Sky's
to.
the
But
limit. But it can't happen without you.
the point that I want to make in this totally unreadable source code down here is that there's a track tag in here. So this is video track, and then it calls it the video. So we've got track kind equals subtitles, track kind equals subtitles again, and one is English, one is German. So you can add captions directly in the video, and if you're using Chrome, voila, you can do that now. If you're using anything else, you're going to have to supplement it with some JavaScript. But this is pretty fantastic, really. And if you're using iOS, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can do this now in iOS?
Yeah, iOS 7, I'll demonstrate this tomorrow, but you can use HTML5 Web BTT captions, which was not possible until 7. Before you had to actually put the captions inside QuickTime Movie.
Yeah,
So I'm hoping this will really revolutionize captioning for the web.
right. So again, these are all these great ideas. They're all together, and we just need to kind of kick the browser vendors to get on board. I mean, they're on board.
They can also customize the text style of the caption in iOS 7 to make it like blue or green or whatever they like.
Don't keep your whole presentation down, sorry. Yeah, so there's a lot you can do. HTML5 is pushing in that direction. And with JavaScript plus HTML5 plus ARIA, you can do it now. In the future, you'll probably be able to do it just with HTML5 pretty easily. So, going back over here. Forms, now we just had a whole presentation on forms, and that was the form validation side of things. Now he ended up, one of his conclusions is basically don't use HTML5 form elements or form enhancements for anything, and that's kind of true. I did a lot of testing last night. But it's kind of cool to at least see what's possible, so let me do that. So for this one, I'm actually going to take it over to the Opera browser, and I'll do the data types first. Well, actually, let me just show you. So this is Firefox. So you want to select a color in Firefox? Good luck. Can't do that. All these end up looking just like regular text edits. Here's a slider that actually does work. Nothing looks particularly fancy here because they don't work. It's all for the future in Firefox. But if we take it over to Opera, which has quite good support, unfortunately it doesn't have good screen reader support, but it has at least good HTML5 form element support. All right, so this is Opera browser. If you want to select a color, look, it's even, I don't know if this is actually native, but it looks native even if it's not. So this is the, if it's not,
It's native.
is it native?
It's native, no, it's-
Yeah, I mean, it looks exactly like it. That's why I wasn't sure if they actually pulled it or just copied it, but anyway, that's the color picker. And then you've got the date picker here. Now, if I just click with the mouse in there, you can also do the Alt down to get it to show up, and then you can tab around. So keyboard accessibility is decent, but you still can't get to it with a screen reader. Daytime didn't really have the support there, but it's got some of the other things. This will also pop down. What was that?
It's right in the middle of the thing. That's popped up with
What's in the
it.
middle? Oh, sorry. I can't see where the line is. All right, month, month is a weird one, and week is a weird one too, but if you get into that area, or I can force it with the mouse if it basically, it selects the entire month. You know, it does what it's supposed to do, just kind of a strange selector, I think, but there it is. And then week kind of does the same thing. It'll select an entire week at a time. Yeah, so these are pretty cool, and they work now in Opera. Doesn't help you if you're blind, but these are functional. And if you're using Firefox, you're going to get a bunch of text inputs that don't look anything like this. Now here's one that's kind of interesting too. So email is a new type of, it's an attribute you can look for. So it's basically, is validating it before you submit it. Is this an email form field or not? Or did you fill it in correctly? So I'm going to put in something that's not an email. And then I get this message that says, please enter an email address because I didn't. So this is, I mean, it's in Opera now, and it's in some of the others as well, but it's not across the board. The only problem is, again, this is not accessible form validation, so you can't count on it yet for accessibility. So my whole talk is kind of like, isn't this so cool? Sorry, I can't. And then something similar with this is a range 1 to 10 for number, and a range in a slider format, and then telephone. Actually, I don't remember if this. I don't think this one's supported anywhere. Yeah, this one doesn't do anything. But anyway, those are the new attributes and input types. Let me go back to some of the attributes up here that I've skipped over. And I don't think I've lost my internet. Oh, I can't win. Okay, well, there are other attributes. Yes, there are. We get things like autocomplete and read-only and a bunch of other things, which I guess we're going to have to just have you look at these slides later. Yeah, we're good to go. So, maybe I can reconnect again, though. Let me give it a try. Hot. Maybe. Okay, good. All right, so let me quickly go through these, and then we've got like 2 minutes, I know, so race through them. We've got a bunch of new attributes for forms, autocomplete, autofocus, form action, a bunch of others that aren't really relevant to what I'm talking about, and placeholder. That's a good one. So autocomplete, let me just mention that one. What autocomplete does, records the present line again, is if I fill this in, so that's my name, Paul, and it's not going to enlarge that part, but line again. Because I filled out my first name in other forms, it knows that my first name is Paul, or at least it knows that somebody who used this computer typed in Paul for the first name field. And in the code, I've marked it with the entire form is marked with autocomplete on, so that's why that's allowing that. But then within the last name field, I've turned it off. So even though I have typed in my last name before, it's not pulling it up. So I've turned that off. This is useful on like banking websites for social security number, account number, anything that you don't want just to be populated automatically. So that's why that's there. Now the bad news for accessibility is that the screen readers don't read it. And maybe that's not horrible, but the whole idea is to save people some time by making it drop down. And that's not populated, so screen reader users don't hear that. Not only that, but they don't know that this is an auto-complete field at all. They just get to it and it's a regular text field as far as they're concerned. They don't even know. Now you can, if I put the cursor in here and use the down arrow, that does allow me to select it, but screen reader users don't know that because it didn't tell them that that was even possible. You could include instructions, but the problem is the screen readers won't read it anyway because it's not it's not built in the browser accessibly. And that's, I should caveat, put an asterisk by that and say, I think that NVDA actually does read it with Firefox, but that's not across the board. So you can't count on screen readers being able to read that yet, because it's not, the browsers haven't made it available to the screen readers. They haven't done their job. Autofocus. So this puts the focus in the field. So if I just go to this page for the first time, the focus will go here automatically. So good news and bad news. Well, I'll just say it. So putting the focus in a field, like let's say you're on the Google homepage and they want you to search, right? That actually kind of makes sense. But if you're, because people go to that page a lot and they search a lot, if it's on a website that people don't go to a lot, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do this because you're moving the focus away from where they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be in the upper left, but you were putting it somewhere else. So that's confusing, number one. Number two, well, that's the bad news. The good news is that this method actually has several advantages over the tab index method. If you use tab index, let's say we set tab index to 1 here, and then it goes there, and then I was out of the room during your presentation, but I think you talked about that a little bit, where a lot of people set the tab index on all the fields except for the submit button, and because they just forget. This avoids that problem by putting the autofocus in here. It takes it there, and then when you hit tab next time, it goes to whatever would have been next in the natural order. So that's an improvement over tab index, which if you just put in one tab index, it goes directly to that field, and then it goes back to the beginning of the document after it's gone through all the tab indexes that you put in. This keeps it in the flow, and that's a positive thing. If you must use it, which I don't think most websites do. Placeholder, missing example.
It's just a placeholder.
Yeah, it's a placeholder.
I showed an example.
Yeah, so placeholder is where you put something in the field that's just populating it, right? Screen readers generally don't read that, but that may change in the future, but you can't count on that now. So you probably said this already, but don't count on that for instructions, because screen readers won't read it. So a common place, and I'm just going to cheat and pretend that this doesn't say name to it. A common thing that people do is they put a search placeholder on a search field, and they want that to act as the label. If you're using an HTML5 placeholder, it won't be read, and so they'll basically get no label. Now you could do this in combination with ARIA label, or you could do kind of some other fancy things, and that may be appropriate, but just know that the HTML5 placeholder, at least as it's implemented now, in my testing, unless you know differently.
No, I just say that's by design. It shouldn't function as label.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, it's not
You'll
supposed
always
to be
need
labeled.
some
It is
sort
read
of.
by iOS.
Is it?
Yeah, but you're supposed to have an accessible name that is not derived from
Right, right. Yeah, it's never, this was not designed to be a label, even if it is read by iOS or whatever. Yeah. All right, I think I'm at my limit of time, but I think I've covered nearly everything, at least quickly. Oh, Canvas. Really, Canvas is enormous. I'm not going to really get into it, but let me just say a couple things quickly about it. I'm on screen. All right. So, blank canvas, right? There are two ways of thinking about Canvas. Canvas is a way to draw on a web page using scripting and text. And so, one way that you could approach it is to say, we're going to create this nice, fancy graphic. Let's say it's a graph or something like that, a chart. And we're going to make that chart directly accessible to the screen reader. And actually, you can do that. You can make a chart directly accessible in Canvas to a screen reader. It'll take you some work to do that, but you can. That's one approach, to say we're going to do it in a graphic, and we're going to make that graphic directly accessible. A flip side, a reverse way of looking at it is you could say we're going to create some data, put it in the table, and generate a Canvas element from the data. And that's usually a better approach to it, at least for charts and graphs. So put it in HTML first, use a script to create the canvas element, give it a simple alt text because you've already got the long description there that makes it accessible. And you don't have to worry about making the canvas accessible that way. Now, if it's not a charted graph, then of course that doesn't apply, but just a thought there. So, that's enough, I think.